This is the Comics Alternative Manga. Reviews of Dead Demons DDDD Destruction, Volume 1, The Troublemakers, and Wotakoi, Love is Hard for Otaku, Volume 1. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Manga. I'm Derek.
And I'm Shea.
And we're two academics who absolutely love manga. And on this episode, Shea and I discuss three titles that are quite different, one from the other. That might be an understatement. We're going to begin with Inio Asano's Dead Demons DDDD Destruction. And make sure you have the 4 D's before destruction. I don't know if I did that or not. Then after that, we're going to turn to The Troublemakers by Baron Yoshimoto. And then we're going to wrap up with Wotakoi, Love is Hard for Otaku by Fujita. But before we get to that conversation, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Manga is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off at the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those prices can be anywhere from 20 to 35% off the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some incredible specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off the cover price. Sometimes 50% off cover, but every now and again you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that.
That's right. Like this month, you can get volumes of series like Bakuman for 30% off, and you can get books like Hirohiko Araki's Manga in Theory and Practice for 30% off.
That's right. It's a great place to find good prices on manga or other kinds of comics. So go to dcbservice.com. They will take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that Shea and Derek sent you. Well, Shea, maybe we should start off by saying that, or by apologizing to our listeners, because listeners of the Comics Alternative, especially the manga series, will recall that last month we, I guess toward the beginning of the month, put out a show and said it's actually the April show because we were a little too late with the April show, and that we would have another one at the tail end of May. Well, you and I had problems coordinating our schedules, and so we didn't have a May show, so now this is the June show, and I'm not going to make any promises now, so Shea and I will say we may or we may not have another show in June. It all depends.
I think we've learned our lesson not to promise too much, but if we can manage a second show this month, that will be a nice surprise for listeners.
Yeah. So think of it as, will we or won't we? It's the suspense that will drive you. Well, Shea, let's begin with our first title, Dead Demons DDDD Destruction. This is by Inio Asano, and it's published by VIZ Media. And this first volume came out April 17th. And we've been looking forward to this, right?
Yes. We've talked about Inio Asano's work on the show before.
A number of times.
Longtime listeners of the manga episodes will know that we are Asano super fans. Mm-hmm. So the thought of getting more of his work. Just we left at the opportunity.
Yeah, it's always big news when a new Asano narrative is translated for English speakers, because the majority of his work isn't, surprisingly.
I'm looking at I'm just looking at his Wikipedia page right now, and there's a number of titles that don't even have English translations of the titles. But I would love to get, to read City of Lights or An Ordinary Day, whatever those are. I would be thrilled to get a chance to read them.
It would be great. Yeah. Asano, as you said, it's one of both of our favorites. And in fact, three of my favorite contemporary manga creators, producing ongoing material currently, is Naoki Urasawa, Teo Matsumoto, and then Inio Asano.
I would have picked them as my three as well, I think.
Wow. Great minds think alike.
So, we've talked about Urasawa and Matsumoto on the show before, and I think Asano's work is just as powerful as something like Sunny, and it's just as moving. And he's I think consistently one of the most inventive and unusual and just striking cartoonists. I wouldn't even say just limited to Japan, but I think I would say Asano is one of my favorite cartoonists working today in the entire world.
Yeah, and in fact, last month he was at TCAF.
Yes, I heard, and I really gotta get to TCAF because they've had Asano and they've had Matsumoto in the last few years. I think they've even had Matsumoto and Asano design posters for the show that I'd love to get my hands on. But you actually got something of Asano's brought back for you from TCAF.
Yes, my friend and the co-host of the Eurocomics series, Pascal Hammond, he went. I think he always goes to TCAF, or almost always goes. And he was kind enough to get for me a TCAF exclusive VIZ signature edition of Salonen an epilogue. And it's not very long at all, but it's kind of it's not a necessary epilogue to Salonen. So for those listeners who may be familiar with Salonen, it's a very early work of Asano's, and it ends well and it stands on its own. But the epilogue kind of adds not necessary, but nice addition at the end. And he's doing some interesting things there in that volume. In fact, you can also think of it as a final chapter because it's even numbered as the other chapters in Salonen. The style, at first I had to do a double take and wondered, did he have someone else do the art while he did the writing for this? But he didn't. And the style is different. It reminded me a tad of Sonny Liu, believe it or not. But there
in the epilogue or in the main book itself?
No, in most of the epilogue. Now the epilogue, it's short, but it is composed of the main epilogue, you could argue, and then there's several section, maybe 10-page, 15-page section right before that you could argue is kind of a setup. And in fact, in that setup, the narrative time is actually later than the arguably epilogue part of this epilogue volume. I mean, it's different what he's doing, but he mentioned in an afterword that he wanted to revisit. He didn't feel like he had to, but he just wanted to revisit Salonen 10 years after the fact. And it was good. So one of the things that I did over the weekend was to reread Salonen. After I read the stuff for today's show, of course, is to reread Salonen because it had been so many years since I had read Salonen and I'd forgotten a lot of it in order for me to be able to read and appreciate the epilogue.
Now, I'm really familiar with Asano's later work like Dead Demon and A Girl on the Shore, which we've also talked about, or Punpun. And you can really see in that work the way he's I know his process now is to largely take photographs or use photographs and then draw over them to create these like hyper realistic backgrounds. And so I'm really familiar with his work, looking like that, in that very realistic form. But it sounds like the epilogue, which he produced pretty recently, it looks like in the last couple of years. It sounds like he's kind of doing something a little different with the art in that. Do you mind elaborating on that a little bit? And maybe that would be a good opportunity to kind of transition into his later work, like Dead Demon.
Yeah, which we're supposed to be talking about. No, that's a good point. The art style in Salonen, the original, is more or less consistent. There may be one or two photographs that he inserts, and there may be one or two examples of like a little iconic cartoony character that he puts at some point in the narrative. But that's really limited. Now, one of the things that marks the art style of the epilogue from the original is there does seem to be a little more experimentation. As I mentioned, the epilogue proper, the art is very different. And in fact, Salonen and the other characters, Kaio, as another example, look completely different from the way that they do in that very first kind of setup part of the epilogue. It's starting to sound a little confusing, and definitely look different from the way that they do in the original Salonen. So there does seem to be, you can see, well, Salonen was, as I mentioned, an early work of his. And of course, with every artist, they develop and they do different things as they go along. They learn certain skills. They decide not to do things anymore, so on and so forth. And you can tell in the epilogue that he's writing that in the same way that he wrote, let's say, the script of his previous works, but his art style is definitely informed by some of his later works. So, in other words, a good way of looking at Salonen epilogue, and by the way, even though what I read as a paperback is a TCAF exclusive, I saw that it is available on in digital format.
Oh, okay.
So you can get it for not that many bucks at all, if you want to read that.
I will. Well, when I get around to reading Salonen, I will definitely add on this epilogue.
Yeah, but you could tell that he, Salonen in terms of style is Asano writing or revisiting Salonen, the original, through his later works.
That sounds interesting. I'll have to. I hadn't really heard much about the epilogue. I knew a couple people who went to TCAF, and so I was kind of aware that it was a thing that was available, but no one has effectively sold me on it the way you are currently selling me on it. So I'm excited to get around and to check this out at some point now. Well, you definitely should. Yeah. So trying to move us a little more towards Dead Demon, Dead Destruction.
I guess it is Dead. I've been saying D.
Who knows? There's a lot of
we're reading the English translation, so it's Destruction because you say destruction, not destruction.
Yeah. But I mentioned Asano's his penchant for his contemporary work, at least to rely really heavily on these incredibly elaborate and incredibly detailed drawings of landscapes or of cities, and that's definitely a fixture of this series. A number of the most striking pages for me are the scene. I think it's a pair of double page spreads back to back that are. You see the two main characters standing on a building, and the title is is displayed next to them, and then you get a kind of reverse shot and you see what they're looking at, and it's this enormous alien spaceship, which I guess we should elaborate on in a second. But
the pages you're referring to are what, 26, 27, 28, and 29?
Right around there sounds. Yeah. It should be the first title page where he kind of he draws the title out, and then he when he reverses the shot, you see the back of the title, and so you see the words reversed. So I mean, I guess, Mike, I'm curious to see kind of what you made of those scenes, or maybe that scene in particular, and that might allow us to transition into the aliens that I mentioned and how they feature into this story.
Well, let me mention first that it's interesting that this is a series that is still currently running in Japan, and it started in, I think, April of 2014, and it's being published in Big Comics Spirits magazine. But those are great questions to, I guess, start us off. I'm taken by it. That's one of the things that I find as a characteristic of more recent Inio Asano is the way that he plays with font, and he inserts titles directly into the story itself in ways that, a vast majority of mangaka do not. I think the landscapes definitely is a big part of what he does here, because we saw some of that in Goodnight Punpun as well. And you mentioned perspective, like, for instance, those pages 26 and 27, and then you turn and you get to see what the two main characters are looking at. I think perspective is another marking characteristic of more recent Asano. There are a variety of examples in this first volume of Dead Demons. And by the way, I'm not going to say every time we mention the title, Dead Demons, Destruction. I'll just shorten it to Dead Demons. But there are many examples where you have a scene and you're wondering, what am I looking at? And then you turn the page or you look down to the bottom panel or whatever the case may be, and you see that a particular character is looking at whatever you had just seen, whatever you had just read. So, this strikes me in way. I mean, as much as I loved not only the first issue of Goodnight Punpun, which we discussed on the show, but the entire series, I was really taken by it. I was even more taken by this first volume of Dead Demons. I that's a really I really was struck by this first volume. I thought it was really good, but that's a really tough call to make on whether I enjoyed it more than Punpun. I said I was more struck.
Okay.
Okay. Maybe I'm being maybe I'm equivocating.
No,
but
no. If that's a distinction, if that's the distinction you're making, I should respect that. The question of perspective is really interesting that hadn't occurred to me, but you're right. There is something particularly effective about that shift in perspective, precisely because you get this huge image that is on its own this kind of bold declarative statement, and then you flip the page and Asano manages to kind of one up himself in a way that based on the kind of reaction or emotional state of the characters looking at this thing, you're not expecting for them to be staring at this gigantic flying saucer so nonchalantly, and I think that's really really interesting that to point out that hadn't occurred to me, but his kind of toying around with perspective in that way is really effective.
And as you mentioned, when you turn the pages, those letters, the title is backwards. We're seeing the letters from behind. So the lettering becomes a part of the landscape.
Yeah. And you get to see he plays with, it's not just, he doesn't just reverse the letters, but he, you see the way that, a change in the kind of perspective of the light hitting the letters as though they were objects. You kind of see him playing with that. And so it is, on one hand, a very kind of playful image, and on another, it's a kind of very elaborate, very thoughtful image.
It is because
he's a really, I don't know how he manages to get any of this stuff done. It seems so enormously labor intensive when you look at it.
Well, he has assistants.
Well, that's probably true, but I can't imagine that I can't imagine that there's any way he has enough assistance to make drawing these pages with this level of detail a kind of easy breezy experience.
Right.
Let's put it that way.
And you're right, that shift in perspective of the lettering itself, just those letters, dead, demons, destruction. It looks more ominous when you turn the page than when you originally see it on the page, and the two main characters, Kedode and Anton, are looking up, and you don't know what they're seeing, or at least we don't know yet.
Yeah. Now we've kind of talked around this thing that they're looking at. We've mentioned it, but I guess it would behoove us to, at this point, explain what the hell UFOs are doing in this slice of life comic, and maybe this would be a good opportunity to try and elaborate a plot for listeners who haven't read this.
Okay, how would you strip down the plot? I mean, not the entire thing, but the setup.
Yeah, I think like a lot of other Asano stories, it's a really, really thoughtful, really patient, and really observant slice of life story about these two girls that you mentioned, Kadode and Oren, and they're kind of just going to school, interacting with each other, interacting with their parents. So on the one hand, it's a very simple kind of slice of life story that's consistent with what readers of Asano have come to expect from him. But in another way, it's very weird. The kind of setup, I think setup is a really good word for how to describe how Asano uses these kind of genre trappings. But the kind of setup is that 3 years before the story starts, I believe it's 3 years, but some time briefly or years. Shortly before the start of the story, a giant, it's a giant flying saucer appears over Japan, and that wreaks havoc, and then the attempts to destroy the spaceship, those wreak havoc, and that's 3 years ago, and now these young girls are kind of living in the kind of aftermath of these events, and the way they've changed politics and international relations and the economy and things like that. And so it's so he sets up this world that is very, very similar to ours, but just a little different. If this had happened a number of years ago, and the world had continued to progress for a couple of years, it would resemble ours in many, many ways, but it would be slightly different. And so he kind of sets this this kind of, in some ways, very straightforward slice of life story in this in some ways very fantastical world. Is there anything I've left out? Or?
No, I think you covered the setup quite well. And if you only if you only read until page 21, you would think that this is going to be a story of maybe a couple of schoolgirls and what goes on in terms of the relationships at their school and the rivalries and whatnot, because we do see bits of that in those first 21 pages. We can pretty much tell who the two main characters are, Kadode and Anton. Now, you called her a moment ago, Oran? I thought.
Am I misremembering? I thought her name was spelled Oran. Am I?
No.
I could just be forgetting.
No. In fact, on page 8, you can see that Kadode calls out to her, Anton, aren't those handles hard to use?
Okay. I for some reason I must have just been misremembering. I don't have the book in front of me,
okay.
But yeah. So I just had made a mistake.
Yeah. But no, I think you covered the setup quite well. Now, it does seem like a world that is ours, but this does take place in the year 2034. And a reason we know that is because they talk throughout the text about the events of 831, kind of like we do 9/11. And so apparently 831, August of 2031 is when this spaceship began hovering over Tokyo.
Oh, my understanding was that it was August 31st.
And maybe, that's interesting because I was reading 3/1 as the year.
Yeah, I think it's
so this is I'm reading, very contemporary world of ours then.
Yeah, I'm reading, I have Joe McCullough's review of the book pulled up at the Comics Journal pulled up, and he seems to think that it takes place in 2014, and that was kind of my understanding. Okay. I don't know if I understood it as that 2014 specifically, but
okay, perhaps a convention in Japan is to write out like the month and the date with a slash between the two, and I guess we do that as well, but with the year that follows. And so, since there wasn't a year that followed, I assumed what they meant by 831 is what we mean by 9/11.
Yeah, but like I said, I think that's just was my understanding of it, because, like you said, it the world he kind of
populates. It looks like ours. Yeah,
it's very, very close to ours in terms of technology and clothing and architecture and all of the kind of visual things that we tend to use to identify a time period. So I just had kind of assumed that it would have been August 31st.
Okay. Well, that makes sense. You're right, because it doesn't look that futuristic, although I wonder how different the world in 2031 is going to look from ours. Who knows?
Yeah, that's a fair point.
Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, okay, let's just argue or discuss from the premise that it takes place in contemporary times, the times in which we're living. But the events, with the exception of one or two flashback scenes or chapters, takes place 3 years after those events. And when the aliens, the mothership and all of the other ships that it dispenses first arrived, it wreaked havoc. I mean, and that's to put it lightly. It killed not thousands, but tens of thousands of Tokyo citizens. And it was a devastating event. And in fact, there's one chapter, is it the second, where we're given, I think it's the second chapter, which is the flashback chapter. And we see, at least from the perspective of Kadode, what happened. Because it's a day just like any other day for her. She's playing with her friend Anton. She goes home. She plays a video game. And then her father comes in her room and says, "We've been invaded," or "We're at war," or something to those words. And then they turn on and then Kadode goes to the TV and just sees what's happening. And then that's when we get a lot of the background information about the visitation of the mothership, the other ships that are dispensed to begin destroying buildings and humans. So, yeah, and then after a while, it just stopped.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the destruction stopped, the killing stopped. However, the ship is still there. So, I mean, it's rather creepy. You have, you know, these people living under literally the shadow of this gigantic mothership. They know nothing about it. They don't know why it's there. They don't know why it didn't continue to destroy. And they don't know what to expect. They don't know if any day now the other shoe will drop.
Yeah, I you know, for listeners who haven't read this and kind of don't have the book to look at, I think, I mean, and you can, I'd be curious to see if you agree with this comparison or not. But you know, I found I mean, the way that Asano draws the ship, but also the relationship between kind of the ship and the city underneath it and the people living in its shadow. I found it very, very similar to District 9, and the you know, obviously in the movie you actually see the aliens and you kind of get a sense of what they're about, but that the idea of this giant ship just kind of hovering over this metropolis and people kind of having to accommodate to themselves to the fact that they live under this giant floating thing that could come down at any moment and crush them. So that might be a useful way to kind of envision what you're describing for listeners.
What I was thinking of as well is Warren Ellis's Trees.
Oh yeah, I guess I hadn't thought about that because that's it's those in that series they're not kind of hovering over. It's not a UFO hovering over, but you're right. It is a kind of alien object.
Yes, that are just there. They're not doing much of anything, and people constantly wonder, "What is this thing? What it's about? Why is what is it about? Why is it here?"
Yeah, that hadn't occurred to me, but I think that is a pretty good comparison as well.
Well, let's look a little bit closer at the two main characters. Now, the protagonist I would say the protagonist is Kadeore Koyama. And she's someone who, at least in, current to the time of the story, is drifting. She can't seem to make any commitments except to her friend Anton. And also her favorite character, Isobeyan. And I hope we can talk about Isobeyan later. And she feels like she doesn't have anything to lose. So why be ambitious? Why make a commitment? She doesn't know what to expect, where things are going.
I think there's, for listeners who are familiar with Asano's work, I would say that she's very consistent with, kind of what certainly what I have come to expect from Asano in terms of these young characters who are really grappling deeply with questions of purpose and trying to make sense of what of this or that experience that they're kind of dealing with, experiences that are pretty common as you mature into adulthood. Questions of relationships and, managing emotions and things like that. And so I think, I would agree with your description, and I would add that, she's very much an Asano character who is, kind of in certain ways, kind of drifting, kind of riddled with ennui and really isn't sure, what to do next.
Yes, and also, she's definitely an outsider. When we see her relationships throughout her school, the various characters and classmates, she's someone who she gets along, but she doesn't hang out constantly. Like, for instance, there's one character called Kiho who seems to be a ringleader. And she's not a bad character, but I would say she's a follower, definitely. Mm-hmm. She's superficial. She buys into our standard, or the society's standard definitions of what it takes to be happy, of love, of relationships, of things of that sort. And, Kadode's definitely not a part of that. But a character who's definitely not a part of Kiho's world is Kadode's friend, Otan Nakagawa. She's a nonconformist, and that's probably putting it lightly. She expects everyone to make a full, absolute commitment that is truly their own. Mm-hmm. And also, much of the time, she isn't serious.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she's always playing, she's obsessively playing, I would say, these first person shooters without, just in certain ways, out of like total disregard for like you said, these kind of ideas that that people commonly have about how you are supposed to do certain things or expected to do certain things. I was going to say that Kadode is kind of alienated from those kind of ways of being, but Otan even more so. She's fully immersed in this this virtual world, which again is a kind of trait of Asano's characters. This intense alienation from everyday life that we see in the character of Otan.
Mm-hmm. And so these are our two main characters, and I'm assuming that they are going to be our guides throughout the entire series. In fact, Volume 2, which comes out in July, bears Ontan on the cover. Mm-hmm. Volume 1, Kadode.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that most of this first volume is really given over to Kadode and to Kadode's perspective, but yeah, I got the sense that we would be getting a little bit more of Otan in further as the story develops, and Asano really made me excited to kind of see more of this character and to see the kind of the narrative from her perspective.
Right. Now, I agree with you. This first volume is largely focalized through Kadode. I don't think that'll change in Volume 2 just because we have Ontan on the cover. I mean, he needed some variation, or the designers needed some variation on this. So, but these are going to be, I'm assuming, the two characters that we see that take us through the entire series. Just as with Goodnight Punpun, it was one character, Punpun, who took us through everything. Yeah, arguably, I mean, rightly so, because his name is on the cover.
Yeah. That's a really good point that I almost forgot to mention to you. What do you make of the name? Because in other, obviously, like A Girl on the Shore, reading that book, the title becomes kind of self-evident. Goodnight Punpun, like you said, Punpun is the name of the main character, and so the kind of what the title is supposed to communicate to us is fairly clear in a number of Asano's other titles, but Dead Demons, Dead Destruction, or DDD Destruction. I'm still a little curious as to what we're supposed to make of that.
Okay, my answer is going to be twofold, and they're going to be different answers in levels of hardness for me to answer. Okay. The easy answer response to what I think of the title is I think it's brilliant because it's eye-catching, and at least initially it's enigmatic. And in fact, when I saw this solicited in previews a number of months ago, that was, I guess, the second of the things that got my attention. It's like, ooh, this book. The first was Inio Asano's name attached to it. But the second was this title. It's like, what the hell is Dead Demons, DDD Destruction? It's just funny. And at first, I didn't know what to make of the title. Now, my second response, which it's hard because I hesitate to answer because it may be considered a spoiler or semi-spoiler. Mm-hmm. Okay, do you remember the significance of the word demon?
Yeah, I remember it's. I recall Kadode and Otan briefly talking about it, but I can't recall specifically.
No, this actually comes up in a conversation. Oh God, I think it's between Kadode and yes, it is between Kadode and her quote unquote love interest, her teacher. Dr.
That's right. That's right.
Who becomes the significant character in this story?
Yeah. So obviously, I don't remember. I don't remember that scene as well as you.
Okay. I'll go ahead and mention this. She's telling him. Okay. One day at school, she has a crush on Mr. Watarase, and she had borrowed a book from him, and she tells him toward the end of a school day, this is great. I don't know if I understood everything about it. Can I borrow another book? And he said, sure. I can bring one in another couple of days. She said, how about now? And this takes place, I don't know, maybe a little after halfway the narrative in this first volume. And he says, well, okay, I was just getting ready to go home. And so she accompanies him home. And he's very much aware that this may be a little compromising position for him. And so he says that to her. So by saying that, he kind of extinguishes any of the tension that may be there. But while she's at his house and he's decompressing from work, they have a conversation about this or that. And some of the things that she tells him are quite revealing about herself. So she tells him at one point that her name in kanji is Monday. And when she was younger, the boys made fun of her by kind of inverting the mon and day into demon, calling her a demon. And so the way I read this title is dead demon. This is someone who is metaphorically dead inside. I mentioned that she's drifting. She can't make a commitment. Destruction. Is she going to be destroyed? We know, and this is a segue into something I really wanted to ask you about. We know she's not destroyed. We know she doesn't die, I guess later on in the series. Because there's a brief indicator somewhere fairly early in the text that this is not the case. But maybe it's a different kind of destruction. I don't know. Maybe it's the destruction of the person that the boys were making fun of.
Yeah, I hadn't made the connection of that. Now that you mention it, I do recall that interaction.
Yeah. So she is the demon in the Dead Demons title. Now, the thing I wanted to ask you, okay, I mentioned that we know that she's still alive, probably by the end of the series, and I wanted to know what you made of this. We're, 35 pages into this story. And then all of a sudden we get outside narration. I don't know if you remember this. Responsible adults said everything changed that day. I guess, 8:31. But back then, I was never entirely satisfied with how everything seemed to stay the same. But I suppose that's one kind of happiness. Anyway, that's what I think now. And now is in boldface. Okay, so this is obviously, I think, Kadode speaking. Because as these words are on the page over, I think, 3 pages, 35, 36, 37, we see Kadode on her way home. So we can pretty much assume that, this is her speaking. So if Kadode, from a time later than the series, I'm assuming, is telling us this stuff, then what does it mean?
That's a good point. I agree that I think that that bit of narration is from Kadode's perspective. So much so that I think the first time I read it, it didn't even. didn't clock the fact that you're right. It does sound like she is speaking from some point later in the narrative because of how kind of clearly and obviously it was Kadode's voice. I didn't have to do any work to figure who was speaking out, and so I just kind of took for granted that it was Kadode speaking. So I would agree with that, but you're right. It does suggest that she is alive at some later point in the narrative, which does make the title enigmatic in a way. I think maybe there might be something there in how you were saying that the character is kind of dead inside. She's dead in a sense. Not literally, but a part of her is dead in some way. I think there might be something with that. It would certainly be consistent with kind of what we've seen of Kadode's character so far, and what we kind of expect from Asano's characters as they develop. But it's, it is tough. I think it's the sort of thing that that might make sense at some point, but it's probably gonna be a while after we kind of get a fuller sense of how the narrative develops from this point.
Yeah. Okay. See, I'm working from the assumption that if, this voice from a time later than the narrative is her telling the story. This is, in other words, we're reading her story. That she must be speaking at a temporal point after the series ends. And I have no idea how many volumes this is going to be. So she talks about at least she hints at the difference between herself then and then now. And, she starts off by saying responsible adults said everything changed that day, but back then it was never entirely satisfied, I was never entirely satisfied in how everything seemed to stay the same. But I suppose that's some kind of happiness. But anyway, that's what I think now. So there's the assumption that something has changed her perspective, but we don't know what that is. Now, on the other hand, I think one could read demon as these aliens. And then interpret the title that way. That doesn't have as much resonance with me, though, at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that it's certainly something that you could do. But I also agree with you that for me, I think because of the way that Asano really grounds his narratives in his protagonists and in this kind of liminal or formative state of emotion, I am inclined to read it as a reference to as Kadode as well. I think it's far more interesting to read the series from that perspective. But like you said, it's for all we know, that's we could be way off base, and we could open up the first page of volume 2 to find that nope, it's all about the aliens.
Yeah. Another thing I wanted to point out is I think there's a key passage. You remember I mentioned earlier that she goes to Dr. Watarazi's house. This is during that scene. This is beginning on page 113 and it runs through 116. She's talking with her teacher and he's asking her, maybe you think I have a boring life or life is boring in itself. And she responds, and I'm only going to read her responses, not, his words as well. That would take a long time. She says, I don't have anything I care about like that. The only thing I'm consumed with is airy fantasies. Every day it's just an exercise in killing time. My life is a joke. Maybe I should be more serious, but 831 actually gave me hope. I thought the invaders were going to do something kick-ass. I don't have anything to lose, so I don't care if everything breaks, but the invaders are weak. Why did they even come here? And so basically, she was expecting some kind of a reverse epiphany in a way, right? Something very catastrophic that would give some kind of quote unquote meaning to her life. But as we mentioned, when the aliens came on 831, they destroyed for a while and then stopped. And so she thought that that was a weak response. And because of that, she, I don't know, feels kind of cheated, kind of lost. And her teacher's response to what she just told him is, "You're a weird kid." And so I think in many ways that passage describes the character that we get in this first volume of Kadode.
I think that is a really interesting passage to point to, and I would agree that I think it does really encapsulate that the characters, I don't know, maybe longing for change. You know, she saw maybe the aliens as finally there's a catalyst of change, and it turns out that everything stayed the same in the wake of their arrival. I think that passage really gets at something kind of key about the character to me. Yeah.
Now, in that second chapter, right, the big flashback chapter that tells us more about what happened on 831, it's not as if she's an overly ambitious child, but at least she has some direction, you know. She wants to study. She wants to move ahead. She wants to move up to a point. But then this happened, and, you know, also her father, who went out to the office during this initial visitation, never returns. Of course, they never know if he's alive or dead, but he never returns. And that seems to leave a hole in her as well.
Yeah. I think, that's one of the things that I'm really going to be interested to see how Asano develops. There's we get a little bit of Kadode. Like you said, we get that flashback scene where we learn that Kadode's father went out on that day and never came back. But then we also learn a little bit more about Kadode's mother, who I got the sense was like she was like had gone so hysterical that she was like involving herself in like cults and things like that.
Yeah.
And then Kadode's mother's boyfriend, we see a little bit of him. So there is
Takabatake.
Yeah. So we get this little bit in this first volume. We get a little bit of Kadode's kind of family dynamics and what's going on there. But Asano doesn't spend too much time on it. So I'm really going to be interested to see, you know, where he takes that and how he develops that and kind of elaborates those relationships between Kadode and her various parental figures.
Now, we won't go into too much detail and we won't give anything away, but at the very end of this first volume, there is an event. And, you know, the city is a part of it, or at least the part of the city that is near where the event is. And everybody seems happy. They're celebrating. And in the midst of this, a mystery boy walks up. And he says something. We won't say what he says. And that's how it ends. And so this is, I'm assuming, going to propel us into the second volume coming out in July. So I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah.
Now,
I think I'm. It's one of the few manga series that I'm really excited for.
Yeah,
so
I'm going to keep up with this as each volume comes out. Now, let's wrap, because we've been talking about Dead Demon quite a bit, and I think rightly so. But I'm curious to know what you thought of Isobeyan. Okay, we should mention to our listeners that Isobeyan is a cartoon character. And I guess he is in manga that Kadode is reading. and he may be in other media as well, because she is an Isobeon fanatic. She has an Isobeon backpack, and other things as well. Isobeon, how would you he's like a mushroom with a
He's an incredibly phallic mushroom.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Yeah, when you open on that first page, when you open the cover and see the first page, you see him, and it is quite phallic, but he's also quite thick, which, nonetheless phallic. He has a fuzzy mustache, fuzzy to a point, and he's wearing some kind of, pack in the front of him. And when we first see him, there's a spaceship behind him. So at first you would think that he's an alien, and he may be, but the way that he's described in the little bits of a comic that we get, he's from another dimension, or he is, at least he's able to go from one dimension to another. Now, what do you think of the fact that the book both begins and ends with an Isobeon story, and it's the same story? It just begins in the front of the book and then ends in the back of the book.
That's a really good question. Obviously I was struck by the fact that he does kind of bookend this volume in that way, because it's impossible to miss when you open the book and you're expecting to see this incredibly detailed black and white art featuring two kind of existentially confused teenagers, and then you open it and it's this weird mushroom looking thing. It's impossible to miss, but I don't know if I really have obviously I think he's doing it for some purpose. That's kind of obvious, but I'm not really sure I have a kind of coherent explanation for why he might be doing that at this time, because you're right to point out these kind of parallels in what we see between the Isobeon story and some details about the main narrative, but I can't really figure out how they connect. I can't. I know there's something there, but I'm just unable to kind of see it just yet. So that is something that I'm definitely going to be keeping an eye on. As I continue to read the series, see what he's doing with that character and these kind of metafictions involving that character. Maybe then I'll, as I get a few more instances of him doing this, I'll be able to discern or articulate some hypothesis about why he's doing it. But I gotta say, I was really kind of flummoxed by their appearance in this first volume. I mean, it's the kind of thing that, obviously he's not doing this for no reason, but I can't really figure out what his reason is.
Okay.
So
one explanation, and I would call this the sometimes a cigar is just a cigar explanation, is we know that Kadode is an Isobeon fanatic. So in order to explain that, why don't you begin and end the book with an Isobeon story? Okay, so that's one explanation. I don't necessarily buy that, but I'm waiting till the second volume. And if the second volume does the same thing that the first volume does, in other words, is bookended or framed by an Isobeon story, then I'll start scratching my chin and wondering more, what is Asano doing? And if every volume of Dead Demons does the same thing, it'll be interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I would be surprised by if he bookended every volume in that way. But I wouldn't be surprised to see more chapters open with Isobeon's story that kind of halfway through the chapter we kind of get pulled back into the kind of quote unquote real world of the narrative. Things like that I would expect from him. But I definitely think we'll see more of Isobeon. The way that you mentioned that Kadode is kind of a super fan, and the way that she talks about him to other people gives the impression that there's some significance in Isobeyan's character that relates to some of the characteristics of Kadode that we've been talking about.
Well, one of the things that you mentioned is that first image of Isobeyan is quite phallic. Mm-hmm. Take that, and, to the character of Kadode. I mean, this is her coming of age story, I would say.
That is true.
It seems,
and the other book of Asano's that we talked about that really deals with kind of late, obviously Punpun's about growing up, but it takes place over a much longer period of time. But A Girl on the Shore that we've talked about on the show, is the characters in that are much closer to age to the characters in Dead Dead Demons, and they're dealing with similar kind of issues and emotional challenges. And that book was very, very explicitly sexual and about sex in many ways. And so, I think you laughed, but I think there might actually be something there that will reveal itself as we kind of learn more about the narrative.
You want to move to the next book they're going to be looking at?
Yeah, I think we have talked ourselves to death about Dead Demons.
Yeah. Okay, so this next one is a collection of stories, primarily. It's called The Troublemakers, and it's by a mangaka who has never been translated into English before. And this is Baron Yoshimoto. It's coming out from Retrofit Big Planet, and it was released on May 23rd. Mm-hmm. Now, I say he's never been translated. That may suggest that he is a brand new writer. But if you think that, you would be very mistaken.
Yes, he is. Yoshimoto is one of the wonderful alternative mangaka that did incredible work in the late 60s and early 70s in magazines like Garo.
Even into the 50s.
I don't think any of the stories in the Troublemakers, but yeah, he was producing work during that time, and obviously other, Gekiga, which we've talked about on the show, is
dramatic pictures,
that kind of emerges in the 50s and has its heyday in the 60s and 70s, and Yoshimoto is one of those, like Saichi Hayashi or any number of other cartoonists that maybe had reached American audiences or Western audiences, but were totally unlike what people kind of expected from manga, and so they are not new, but they remain new to us.
Right, because this is the first time that not only these stories have been translated into English, no Yoshimoto narrative has been translated into English.
Yeah, and sometimes there are cartoonists that their work isn't available in English, but we see their work or hear their work referenced or mentioned or talked about by other mangaka. But Yoshimoto was a name that I had never ever heard before, so I really didn't know what to expect from these stories. Was his name something you had come across before, or
never? And I didn't know who this guy was. But when I saw The Troublemakers by Baron Yoshimoto listed in this year's releases from Retrofit Big Planet, I started to scratch my head and wonder, is this someone who has previous books, in English that I should have known about? Okay, let me say that absolutely everything I think that Retrofit Big Planet does is top notch. You can never go wrong with a title from Retrofit Big Planet. We love them on the Comics Alternative, one of our favorite publishers. I would venture to guess that this is one of the standouts of this year's releases. Now, that's saying a lot because there are so many great creators who are coming out with releases this year from Retrofit Big Planet. So yeah, this is the first time that I had heard of him. This is a collection of 6 stories. Eriko's Happiness, High School Brawlers Diddy, Insect, The Gambling Stripper, Nostalgia, and The Girl and the Black Soldier. And then concluding this text is, God, impressive is it's not enough. I would say magnificent essay by the book's editor, Ryan Holmberg.
Yeah, I think we should point out that Holmberg is the translator of these stories and the editor of this collection. And like every other Ryan Holmberg book I have ever encountered, it is great. And it includes, like you said, a really, really terrific, really fun to read, really helpful essay about the author and his work. So for listeners who may not, maybe hesitant to pick this up because they're worried, maybe some of the context or the nuance of the stories will be lost on them because they do come from kind of a cultural milieu that's kind of pretty far removed from ours. Holmberg gives you all of the tools you need to really have fun with these stories. Yeah.
Now you used words like helpful, contextualizing, and even fun, and I think that in many ways defines Holmberg's essay, which is at the very end of the book. On the other hand, I do think it's a quite scholarly essay, but I think it's scholarly without being academic. And what I mean by that is anyone who's familiar with critical writing, if you've been in college, graduate school, master's, PhD program, and you've had to read these critical essays, from my experience, the majority of them are indecipherable. In other words, academics may be smart, but they don't know how to write. In other words, put your ideas in rhetoric that is going to be accessible to people, and not only, people who, are familiar with the material you're writing about, but people who may not be, right? You want to be a writer who is accessible. And most academics, I think, unfortunately, are not. Ryan Holmberg is. And I would thank him.
I would absolutely agree with that. Both your estimation of most academic writing. I think it's possible to be a good scholar and be a terrible writer. And that is, it's often the case that even interesting essays are not the best in the writing department. But Holmberg, like you said, he really nails both aspects of that, and it's something that's I always find his essays really, really informative. This is a guy who really knows what he's talking about. Spent a lot of time with it, and is able to communicate it to people like me who have never heard of Baron Yoshimoto, who have no idea his significance, who have no idea what his work is like. He's able to really communicate that effectively and give me a really strong sense of it. So we could talk about this essay all day. I think we enjoyed it so much, but we should
get to the stories, right?
The stories.
Now, okay, anytime we discuss a collection such as this, I'm not sure how to begin. Do we start at the beginning with the first story, or do we talk about which stories really stood out to us the most? Not necessarily favorites. How do you want to proceed?
I think we can. I
don't want to go story by story by story necessarily. We can skip around if you want.
Yeah, I think it's fortunate that I also have the same difficulty when kind of trying to figure out how to begin talking about a collection of stories like this. But I think fortunately, We can start at the very beginning. We can start at the cover, in fact, and we can talk about
good point.
one of my favorite stories in the collection, which is Eriko's Happiness, which is the first story in the collection. And also, it's where the first page of Eriko's Happiness is the image that's the cover of the book itself. So, how did you find? I guess I'm curious how you found Eriko's Happiness. Obviously, I liked it, but
I found it interesting, and I appreciated it even more after Holmberg's essay, because what he does is he puts it into context. And then part of that context is about the cover. This is what I thought you were going to point out. If you look at the cover of the Troublemakers, which is an early scene from Eriko's Happiness, you see a rather sexualized and glamorous high school girl hugging a tree. And the reason she looks glamorous is because Yoshimoto he's still alive, has a background in fashion illustration.
Oh.
And so this is an image. It could be something out of a fashion magazine, from its time.
Yeah. And I think that's, I think you can kind of get that sense from just looking at it without having read the image, just the way he draws the kind of drapery and the folds of Eriko's skirt, for example.
And in fact, that's the image from the very first page. And on the first page, Eriko says, "My name is Eriko. I'm 18. And so she becomes the narrator of this story. And the story that she tells is basically, she's in high school. It's not long before she graduates. At one point, she meets an older man, and I can't remember the older man's daddy, or the older man's, and there's a reason why I made
real
that
name.
mistake. Yeah, the real name.
I can't remember his real name either.
Yeah, I was looking at a page where she calls him daddy, and she does. It's like a pet name for him.
Yeah, it's almost. I think it's almost exclusively how she refers to him throughout the story.
Okay.
There might be one instance where she calls him by a different name.
So she has a relationship with this older man, but it's a restricted relationship. She can only visit him on certain days at certain times. And the reason for that is other women visit him on certain days at other times. And so sometimes as she's exiting the door, the other woman is out in the hallway waiting to come in. So basically, this older man, he's in his 40s, he has a series of lovers from different walks of life, it appears to me. And so she's about to graduate. She doesn't know what she's going to do after graduation. And that becomes kind of a part of her relationship with him. And then there's something that happens, and we won't give it away, at the very end of this story that changes the way that she's looking at her life.
Mm-hmm.
And that's it's when it involves a classmate of hers who also falls for this older man, her daddy.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned, I think just to get into the story, you mentioned that, she calls him daddy. How could our listeners forget? And that, she is she's an 18-year-old, and she tells us so on the very first page, in like you said, in this kind of sexualized image, and she's engaged in a sexual relationship with this older man, significantly older man who takes care of her, and so obviously sex and sexuality is foregrounded in this story, and I think on opening the book and seeing that first image, I was kind of expecting the story to be pretty exploitative. It's a comic from the I think this one is from 71 or 72,
72.
So the early 70s, and you have that as the first page. I was expecting it to be fairly exploitative and to be kind of complicit in the sexualization of this young girl, and and things like that. But I found that Yoshimoto's kind of approach to the passages of sex and sexuality, I found them to be much more nuanced within the story than I was kind of expecting as I began it. Did you have a similar reaction, or what was your take on?
No. My response is very similar to yours. When I started the story, I did think that this was going to be an exploitive narrative in some way or the other. Now, you could argue that, yeah, it is, because you have this 40-some-year-old guy having as one of his lovers an 18-year-old high school girl. But I thought it was going to go one direction, but then by the very end, it went someplace completely different. But even before the end, it became something else entirely, with what I would consider two of the main symbols of this story, the balcony and the sparrows. Mm-hmm. Now, Eriko, she comes to the apartment, of course, to see her daddy. But she also comes because she loves the balcony. She's very drawn to the balcony, and she's all the time looking out over the city, right, from the balcony. And so there's this sense of openness and freedom. Again, it's one of these heavy symbols of the story. But another, I would argue, heavy symbol are the sparrows. Because when she's out on the balcony the first time, I think she ends up giving them some grain. And of course, a whole flock of them come, and she's, delighted to see them. And then every time afterwards that she visits her daddy, she goes to the balcony, she always has some grain ready, and the sparrows know to come flying down. And sometimes she'll put the grain in particular order, like little concentric circles, and watch the way that they will eat. So she's fascinated by those sparrows. But again, kind of like the balcony, the sparrows most certainly represent freedom and for her. And keep in mind, this is a stage of her life where she is about to graduate from high school, and anything is possible for her. So what's she going to do? The world is open to her, just like the scene outside on the balcony is open.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to describe kind of how she's interacting with these various elements of the story. I think that's really where what Yoshimoto does well, that maybe some of his other contemporaries or even or cartoonists from any period or artists from any period, the trap that they might fall into of making the audience kind of complicit in the sexualization of this young girl, of maybe appearing at points to critique the way we tend to sexualize young women, but then also kind of making it a kind of pleasurable experience for the viewer, making them in a way enjoy that sexualization that the story is critiquing. I think Yoshimoto, instead of making it about how Eriko appears to us and kind of how the way she looks or the things she does makes us feel, the story is really about her interiority, and it's very much about how she is feeling about this kind of transitional period, or what's about to be a transitional period in her life, and her kind of figuring out how she feels about it, and figuring out how to kind of express those feelings in a way that, maybe her having a sexual relationship with this 40-year-old man isn't the healthiest thing for her. I certainly think it's gross, but I'm not naive. I know that it is something that does happen in the world. And instead of just, kind of rendering that for us, and making it kind of sexualizing it for us, Yoshimoto renders it and really explores the kind of psychology behind why people might make those decisions that, from our perspective, appear strange or unreasonable. And so I really appreciated that aspect of the story.
Right. And another thing that Yoshimoto does in this story is I don't want to say humanizes the context or the situation between this older man and a high school girl. But at least from her perspective, Yoshimoto gives her feeling, motive, not so much conflict, except at the very end. But he does, I guess, to some degree, humanize her more. Because in other words, she becomes less of a victim and more of a fully fleshed out individual who's doing something because she wants to, and then later on makes another decision, which is the conclusion of the story.
Yeah, and I like that. I like that Yoshimoto isn't. He's careful not to judge her decisions.
That's an important point.
Yeah, like I said, I think we would agree that an 18-year-old high school student having a relationship like this with a 40-some-odd-year-old man is kind of disturbing in many ways. But like I said, it is a decision that a lot of people do make, and Yoshimoto is careful to understand that and really try and be empathetic and understand why someone might be motivated to make that choice, and because it is a choice. It's not something she's being forced to do, and so there's the relationship there, and Eriko's relationship to herself is far richer and far more complicated than I think this story would be in I think most other people's hands.
Mm-hmm. At least one other thing I want to say about this story. Don't lean on the rail. I don't know if you want to go to the next one or if you just want to talk about another story within this collection.
Well, I'd be up for talking about the high school brawlers ditty, because I enjoyed that story as well. But if you had one that you were really...
No, we can talk about that. Yeah, that's the second story in this collection, High School Brawlers ditty. And this was originally published in 1974. And what you have here is basically a high school student who... has his uniform, but he's not so much concerned with school studies as he is with brawling and establishing boundaries. This is mine. Listen to me. I'm the authority. I know what I'm talking about. And he and his gang definitely have a territory. And so their ditty, and we hear it, I think, 2 or 3 times in the story, kind of defines what they do and who they are. But the thing is, what is the main character's name? I forgot to write it down. But he's someone who he may think he knows what's going on, but actually he doesn't. Because there is a young woman that he has a thing for, whose virtue he thinks he's defending, but he's actually not, because she tells him, "What are you doing? You don't know what I want. You don't know about my relationship with this other guy."
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point to bring up, and I'm glad you did, because it's a kind of another point where Yoshimoto, we can see a kind of maybe a point of comparison between Eriko's happiness and this story, where Yoshimoto seems to be really concerned and attentive to the delusions of men, right? The
as opposed to the awareness of women,
right? Well, I think Eriko's happiness is in some ways concerned with the kind of coming to awareness, but this story in particular is I think certainly more concerned with kind of the way that men delude themselves into thinking that they have to shore up women's shortcomings in some way, or defend them, do for them what they cannot do for themselves. And he seems to be really aware of the fact that that it often is a delusion. It is often something that men we tell ourselves to make ourselves feel better. And so I think in some ways the story is pretty light, and in other ways it's pretty. It's a pretty mature work, I think.
It is, and this is another one of those stories that has a twist at the end, and we won't tell you what that twist is. But one of the things that you can find in Holmberg's essay at the back of the book is this story is a part of a certain kind of writing that was a part of its time. It was quite popular, and the vast majority of those stories kind of ended in a certain way. This one, you think it's going to end in that way, but it doesn't. But by the end of the story, you wonder if our protagonist has learned anything. And I'm assuming, I think rightly, no, of course not, because this guy has no awareness of the world around him and of what he needs to do in interacting. You talked about the way that he assumed he should interact with women. There's also a way that he is delusional when it comes to his relationships with other men. You know, there's one scene toward the beginning of the story where his gang and then a rival gang confront each other. Actually, the rival gang kind of, antagonizes the protagonist's gang. But the protagonist's gang are able to easily defeat and humiliate the other ones, to the point that one of the members of that gang goes to a member, or I guess, what do you call him? A general? I don't know. Someone who's head in the Yakuza, and says, I'd like to join your organization after I graduate, but I have one request. If I do this, is that you allow me to use a few of your men to take some revenge. And of course, that revenge is trying to get back at the protagonist for what he did. And so that becomes the major fight scene at the end.
Yeah, I think it is good to point out, like you said, that it is also kind of, I guess, two things. One is, like you said, he is kind of delusional about. He's not only delusional about kind of his relationships to women, but he's also delusional about his relationships to other men. He's kind of everyone is constantly misunderstanding each other at various points in these very small and minor ways, and I see those two things as kind of being related to one another, as though they have a kind of, maybe they share a common cause. But so I think that it's good that you pointed that out. And then second, I would say that you point out that this protagonist doesn't learn anything by the end of the story, and
Sei, that's his name, Sei.
And I would agree with that. I think we don't get the sense that he has had a kind of revelation or epiphany, but and so in that way, the story kind of reminded me of the works of I can't recall his first name, Tatsumi, Yoshihiro Tatsumi. I might be misremembering part of that last name, but it reminded me of many of his shorter stories that are, that seem to be about a protagonist learning a lesson, but just like in real life, the protagonist ultimately doesn't. But I think the difference between Yoshimoto and Tatsumi is that I get the sense that Yoshimoto understands that it's really not about the character learning anything as much as it's about us learning something. And so I think that you are right, and I agree that Seiya doesn't he doesn't have this revelation, but his this kind of narrative and the way that Yoshimoto tells his story, and I think this is why what's so interesting about Yoshimoto's work is that he tells these stories in a way that really gives us an opportunity to think about the kind of problems and the challenges facing these characters, and that even if they don't learn from their experiences, we can think about and talk through them like we're doing now, and we can come to some sort of understanding about the world, and maybe we also have kind of skewed understandings of our relationships to women or to other men, and that this story provides us an opportunity to kind of work through that.
That's exactly right. I mean, we can learn whatever, by a character's either decision or lack of decision or inability to make a decision. Mm-hmm. We can learn through their shortcomings, in other words.
I didn't have too much to add about this story.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting story, and it's very dramatic. One last thing before we move on is I want to ask you, do you think that Sei looks like Elvis? A young Elvis?
It hadn't occurred to me.
I don't think it was intentional. Maybe I just read too much visually into that.
No, I'm very rarely thinking about Elvis, so I would never have made that connection. But I can see how you see that. Yeah, I can see the kind of the way he's drawn does bear some resemblance to a young Elvis.
That third story, Insect, is one of my favorites. Or one of the ones that had the most impact on me. Let's just say.
Yeah, I was. I'm glad we're going to talk about Insect before we move on to our third book, because I had a similar reaction that it was. I thought it was great. I thought it was incredibly. It was incredibly drawn. It is terrific.
This is one of the longest stories in the collection. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And this is basically the story of when we first see him, a young boy by the name of Shinji. Is it Shinji? Shinji. Mm-hmm. And he's a little on the slow side, I guess we could say. And when we first see him, he and his mother are living in Sakai village in the southern Tama province on the outskirts of Tokyo, and I know that because Yoshimoto makes that clear on the very first page. Mm-hmm. And we have him and his interaction with the other kids of the community. It's never good. They make fun of him. For instance, one of the first things that we see that they do to taunt him is they make him take off his sandals and step in horse manure, or at least some kind of manure. Yeah,
we talked about Inio Asano bearing some resemblance to Taiyo Matsumoto, but there is something about this story that kind of reminded me of Matsumoto's. I think it's maybe darker than something like Sunny.
Definitely.
But I think the actions of characters that they kind of wreak on this poor innocent protagonist are maybe more severe than some of the kind of teasing or light bullying that goes on in something like Sunny or Tekken Kincrete. But there is that same sort of dynamic of a kind of a different protagonist who is kind of treated poorly by his peers and those a little older than him just because of that difference.
Right. And we see CJ through a series of moments in his life, and it takes him from the village to the city, and then he has a series of jobs, all of which he fails miserably at, because he's just not able to do them. But at each of those moments of his life that we witness, there is, I guess, an antagonist named Koichi.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Koichi, when we first see him, he is the young son of, I guess, the head of the village.
Mm-hmm.
And so he has kind of a privileged position. And
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he's definitely privileged because he's treated in ways quite different from the way that the other boys are. Now, later in life, he seems a little more, I don't want to say sympathetic, maybe approachable. Okay. He's not the kind of character who grated on my nerves in the first scene. And I think grated for good reason. Just a little brat. And again, that's putting it lightly.
I'm glad you brought up this character of Koichi because, we've talked about, Eriko's happiness and the high school brawlers ditty as being sort of mature works that have kind of simple, or not. Yeah, I guess simple would be. They're fairly simple stories. They're easy to read. They're easy to follow. They're fairly accessible, but there is something very complicated going on, maybe under the surface. And I think in this story, that kind of takes the form of this character of Koichi and the kind of the way that Yoshimoto positions both of these characters as kind of foils for one another, and he really teases out the effect and the compounding effect of class difference and the effect that can have on the trajectory of someone's life. Like you said, Koichi is kind of privileged, bratty child, and he grows up into someone. He goes to a good school because his parents can afford to send him there, and because of his father's connections, he gets a good job that's not as physically taxing as the one that Saiichi has. In one scene, if I'm remembering correctly, Saiichi is working the floor of a factory, and Koichi encounters him because Koichi is kind of this white collar middle management figure in the company, and so there is like we've kind of talked about with the other two stories, there is something on in one hand very simple about those characters and very simple and intuitively understandable about their relationship to one another, right? Like you said, Keiichi, he as a child he's bratty, he's privileged, he gets on your nerves, he grates, and I think that sense of him as a child it's kind of mitigated or obviated in various ways as he kind of grows and matures, but it is still present. We get the sense of the kind of gulf between these characters' station in life that Saiichi is resentful about that fact, and that resentment is apparent to us in the way that Yoshimoto renders Saiichi's foil.
Right. Now later, when they're both adults, when Saiichi is taking on other jobs, other tasks, he, of course, encounters Kiyoshi. And Kiyoshi is someone who wants to help him. He says, I can help you find a better job, or let me give you some money, so on and so forth. And so this happens, repetition. I mean, it's a familiar repetition in this narrative. But it has a very notable conclusion, and we won't tell you what that conclusion is. Now, one of the things that strikes me about this story, Insect, is that the saddest thing about it is that not so much that Saiichi is abused. I mean, and feels abused. I mean, he is definitely. But the fact that he is the one character in this book, child or adult, who has a sense of not only decency, but empathy. So he can understand, or he wants to understand, other humans and other animals. He cares for them. And there's a scene with a dog at the very end that kind of propagates this twist. But the sad part about this story is the fact that that kind of empathy, that kind of ability to reach out your heart doesn't succeed.
No, it's
in other words, it's Trump's world.
I think what Yoshimoto can teach us is that, you know, maybe those aspects of life are more pronounced and more striking now, but that's kind of always been the case. You know, it's always been people who really do sincerely care deeply about others and you know, animals or insects. They are often mocked and made fun of and ridiculed. You know, you know, to feel for others that deeply, you know, you can't work in a job where, you know, you taking home $40,000 a year is predicated on some small child in Taiwan working in a factory with suicide nets outside. You know, it's to live in a world, quote unquote, successfully requires you to kind of turn that off at various points. And for people who just can't, it makes life incredibly difficult. And I think Yoshimoto, he provides us an opportunity to really come to realize that for ourselves in a really moving story.
Yeah. Now that next story, the following one, is The Gambling Stripper. This one is both funny and disturbing. The funny parts are the ways in which the Yoshimoto represents the various strippers that we see, and not just the strippers, but also the men who want to ogle the strippers. But and also the relationship between, what is the male character's name? I can't recall real quick. I should have written this stuff down. But yeah, our protagonist is a man who, he's a businessman. He owns a couple of strip joints. But he's someone who, if we can say this, care about what his strip joints are like and what they should be. He has certain ideals, right? Yeah. About what men should get when they visit a brothel like that, or not a brothel, a strip joint.
It should be a classy affair. Yeah. You know, he's the kind of guy who's like the extravagant, high-end strip clubs in like a place like Las Vegas. Like, if it's not going to look like that, don't bother. So yeah, you're right. He does have he has a surprising relationship to sex work.
Junichiro, that's his name, Junichiro. So it's Junichiro meets one of the strippers who is the big draw to a strip club that he visits. And he ends up falling for her. And as you might imagine, they develop a relationship and eventually get married. That relationship to some degree is funny, but then becomes tragic. The disturbing part of this story is what it says about men and misogyny, you know. I don't know. I saw the ending as a mixed message for me. What did you think?
That's a good point. I think,
and again, we don't want to spoil it, so we can't go into much detail about what happens at the very end.
I think you're right to point out that there are elements of the story that are very funny, and I think when I was reading the first time, I was a little preoccupied with those kind of humorous aspects of it, and maybe lulled into not reading it as closely and as I've read some of the other stories in this collection. And so, you know, I think there's something there. I think you're right to point out that there is something about the ending that does not reflect too flatteringly on men, or certainly men in the story. But I think I would have to go back and really reread the story closely to to provide a coherent answer, because when I think of the story, I think most kind of strongly, most prominently of those caricatures of the strippers and the caricatures of the men at the club. So I would have to go take another look at that to really suss it out.
I want to comment on what you're calling the caricatures. Okay, I mean, I agree to a large degree. They are caricatures. But one of the things that struck me when I began reading this story is, wait a minute, the art style is not consistent. Because when we see the majority of the strippers, the men in the audience, they look like cartoons. They look like caricatures. But yet, Junichiro and the gambling, I can't remember his name or her name, but Harumi. And Harumi and even the setting look much more detailed and definitely not cartoony. And I was wondering, why is that? And it occurred to me that what I think Yoshimoto is doing here is, from the perspective of Junichiro, when he walks into the strip club at the very beginning, what he sees around him, he thinks is gaudy. It's repulsive to him. And those women, those men, what they're doing are represented as caricatures. Everything else looks much more in the style that we're used to, having read Troublemakers of Yoshimoto. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I definitely see what you're talking about. And I think I had a similar reaction reading it. I definitely noticed that there was a difference in the way that he was rendering the kind of patrons at this the strip club and the strippers themselves, and how he was rendering these other characters. But I think I was, to be completely honest, I think the story is, I think if we can call it a fault, I think a fault of the story is that we are placed in the kind of perspective of Junichiro. I hate to say maybe too effectively, but we are really strongly made to associate with his point of view. And so, like you said, he kind of views these strippers over here and the people who patronize them as something mockable, as something that he looks at with kind of disdain to some degree. And I think the story adopts that perspective in a way that, maybe I should have done I should have been smarter about kind of discerning where Yoshimoto was making those moves and understanding what he was doing when he was doing it. But I think I was I want to say maybe convinced of. I was convinced by that perspective to kind of adopt it, and so I also looked on those figures with disdain, and maybe I shouldn't have been doing that.
And that's why I think that this is a really good example of how you can focalize visually.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, there's more that we could say about this, or at least more than I can say about this story. But you want to move on to the last two in this collection?
Yeah, we can. I don't really have much to say about either of them, but we can.
Well, I mean, one of the things that really struck me about Nostalgia is that it's based on a poem by Go Ren-shun. And we learned this close to the beginning. And basically, this is a story of a man who earlier in life had a relationship, not a sexual relationship, but a relationship with a young woman who would visit him almost every day as he painted, which he did on the side. I mean, that wasn't his main job. He was a woodworker. And it meant something to him. But at the very beginning of the story, when we're introduced to him, he is it takes place at a shipyard. And that is the writing that introduces the story. I wonder if that's a poem that is direct, or a text that is directly from the Rinshun, the Go Rinshun poem. I'm not sure, but it seemed much more poetic than the writing in the rest of the book. And when we see our protagonist at the shipyard, he sees this young woman with a couple of children, and he's stopped in his tracks because this young woman reminds him of someone that meant a lot to him earlier than in life. And then that's the main story. When he was younger, and this young schoolgirl had apparently a crush on him, and what that meant. And this is one of those stories that I didn't get this until I read Holmberg's essay, does emphasize the kind of displacement or in-between placement of those who are of Korean descent, who are living in Japan in the post-war period, and their place in that society.
Yeah, I don't really have much to add to that. Like I said, I enjoyed the story quite a bit, and I don't have any really cogent thoughts at the moment. But I did like it, though. I would add that I agree with you pointing out that the kind of writing per se that Yoshimoto is doing in this story is he's operating in a kind of distinctly different register from the other stories in the collection, and I think it's a really good example of the kind of versatility of him as a storyteller.
Right, Rin is the name of the main character. Yeah, and he is the one who is of Korean descent, and you can tell he looks a little different from everyone else. And I mean, he's the main character of the story that we're supposed to sympathize with.
Did you find? I guess we shouldn't spend too much time talking about this book, but did you find that association effective?
Yeah. I mean, even before I knew that he was apparently of Korean descent, I was drawn to him and his plight. In what happens to him in this story. So. Now, the last story of the collection, The Girl and the Black Soldier, is the one that doesn't take place in Japan. Yeah, this takes place in German-occupied France during 1944. I would argue, I mean, this is a good story. It's a moving story, but of the six, it's the most simple.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. It's certainly by far the kind of, and we should point out that this is the earliest, it's the last story in the book, but it is the earliest story chronologically.
It originally was published in 1966.
Yeah, I think it's the only one that's in the collection that was published in the 60s.
And it's the only one in the collection that was published in the Kashihan, the rental manga at the time,
and
in which Yoshimoto worked. Yeah,
and I think simple is a good way to describe certainly the aesthetic of the story. It is by far the simplest style of drawing that Yoshimoto employs anywhere in any of these stories. It's very simple lines, very simple compositions. Obviously there's no color. He's not painting like he is in for a couple pages in Insect. The kind of hatching and line work is very simplified. And the narrative, I would agree, is, I don't know if it's by far the simplest narrative in the collection, but it is I think the simplest.
Well, in terms of characters, actions, motivations, I do think it's the simplest.
Oh no, I think it is. I think it is. I wouldn't disagree with that, but I think the gulf between the kind of simplicity of this story and the complexity of some of the other stories isn't as the gulf isn't as wide in terms of narrative as it is in terms of aesthetic. I think the difference between this story and the next simplest in the collection visually is they are much farther apart than maybe this narrative and the next simplest narrative, if we wanted to say that. But yeah, it is simple, and there's some interesting things in it. It's certainly interesting to read in kind of contrast to some of these other stories that, as we've mentioned, are pretty different in terms of setting, aesthetic, narrative, complexity. So I'm glad I read it, but it definitely didn't. It definitely didn't move me quite as much as the other stories, and I
don't think okay, go ahead.
I was going to say that it's. I mean, that's not to say that it's not an effective story. I think it is, but just not quite on par with some of the others. But I do think it's interesting to look at in its own right, because it is the only story where, I mean, like you said, it takes place in German occupied France during World War II, and it doesn't take place in Japan, and its protagonists are not Japanese. But it's the only story where Yoshimoto ever engages explicitly or in this
collection.
I was going to say that it was with race, but I think you could say that
nostalgia deals with
race
or maybe ethnicity.
I think we would say that it deals with ethnicity, whereas this deals with race. But I think from the perspective of a Japanese author, that those two things would be much closer for them than for us. But it's the only story that engages with what we would consider race. The main character, obviously is, as implied or as stated by the title, is kind of Black American soldier, and his race is kind of a huge part of the drama of this story. And so it is interesting in that right to see how this Japanese author is engaging with blackness and with Americanness, and the kind of imbrication of those two things, which is something we kind of tend to think of as the purview of Americans by and large, with a couple exceptions. I'd have to spend a little bit more time with it to really figure out what I think is going on in terms of race and what he's doing with it. But it's certainly interesting to read because of that, because there's something there going on that's interesting to think through.
Again, the ending, the message is quite effective and impactful, but it's nonetheless the way that he deals with race here is kind of simple. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. It's also the one story in this collection that has a heavy 1960s American comic book influence. Mm-hmm. This could be a story out of Marvel or DC during the 1960s, especially with its heavy-handed message at the end.
I think that point of comparison to kind of action comics or war comics, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, the action, the perspective. I mean, there are a couple of scenes that look Kirby-esque. I think certainly there's a shared angularity to the way Kirby draws and the way that Yoshimoto draws in this story, which is much more pointed than his other stories. I think that's I think that's a good way to think about what he's kind of doing, is working in that same mode of war comics and action comics and genre comics, and maybe trying to maybe he's trying to kind of mature them a little bit, but that's essentially the mode that he's working in. Well, dear listener, Shea and I usually only look at 2 books every month, but because we didn't follow through on our promise from May, we're going to give you a third on this episode. And in fact, this is turning out to be the longest episode we've done of the manga series, in the manga series. In this book is Wotakoi, Love is Hard for Otaku by Fujita. And that's it. It's one name, Fujita. And this came out from Kodansha Comics on April 17th.
Mm-hmm. I know we talked briefly about this, our kind of general thoughts and feelings about the book before we started recording, but our listener was not privy to that conversation.
Right.
So, how did you? Well, how did you find this series in the literal sense? I mean, how did you come across it? But also, how did you find it? Was it enjoyable? Kind of what was your reaction to reading it?
Yeah. Well, first off, let me say that this started off as a webcomic on the Japanese site, Pixiv, I guess that's how you pronounce it, in April of 2014. And apparently it was a big success, enough of a success that they published hard copy of the book. And it was a big hit. And now we have an American version. Now, to answer your questions, I found it through a solicit in previews a few months ago. And so I thought, it looks interesting from the solicit. It may be something we want to look at. And then Kodansha, as it usually does, kindly sent us a review copy. And so there you go. We have copies of Wotakoi. My reaction to it, I guess I liked it well enough, but it's not something that's necessarily for me. What I mean by that is I think that the story and the way that the narrative is represented, even down to the level of word balloons and text within the panel, I think, and I'd be curious to hear your reaction, that this is something intended for a younger reader. And by younger reader, I don't mean, some little kid, but I think a more contemporary younger reader. Someone who's used to media being consumed in a way that I may consume it, but I don't do it as much as, let's say, my kids do. Now, this is an example of yoshai. So, it is for, teenage, early adult women.
I was going to say that I don't know if I would describe. I don't think I would say that this is. I think this is aimed at young readers, because when I think of young readers, I think of maybe preteens or early teens, maybe, or younger than that. But I think young adults, so later teens is kind of the sense that I got as well. But I also kind of felt that it wasn't for me. Thinking it's been a little while since I've read it, and about a week, give or take, and at this point, I think it's fine. I think is the most accurate way to describe my feelings on it. I don't particularly feel strongly one way or the other. I think there are some really nice illustrations that are used as chapter breaks. But other than that, the art is not. It's not particularly noteworthy. It's not offensive in any way. It's not what I would call, obviously bad. But there's nothing about it that really particularly moves me either. And I think the narrative is largely the same. It's fine. I read it. It's not as though I was like, how dare I waste my time on this stupid, dumb book. Yeah. But reading it, I had a little bit of a stronger reaction. One thing that, and I still think this is the case, that the series is very concerned with trying to apologize essentially for a lot of the not so great behavior that we associate, or I associate with with people who identify as gamers, for example. People who describe themselves as gamers tend to be people who behave in a certain way and have a certain relationship to games and to culture. Or to anime or whatever. And that behavior is often really toxic and not great. And in some cases, it spills over into abuse. And I don't think anything in this series goes as far as that, but you certainly see characters engaging in behavior that isn't. It's not behavior I think is healthy for them or for the people they kind of subject that behavior to. And the series does seem to be concerned with presenting that behavior as fine, as totally cool, as there's nothing we shouldn't interrogate whether or not it's okay for a woman to just assume that she's unlucky in love because she likes comic books or video games and not because of how she behaves and the way she interacts with her partners. It just kind of expects us to swallow this idea that gamers are people too, and that we shouldn't judge their terrible behavior. And I was kind of, thinking about it now. Like I said, the series seems a little innocuous and anodyne, and so I have a hard time getting too worked up about it. But reading it, I did have a pretty strong reaction of like, wow, I cannot believe that that this is what is being presented to me. Other than that, like I said, I don't really have a ton to say about this because it is so. Unfortunately, it's pretty unremarkable in a lot of ways. Yeah, well, I think for what it is, it's fine. And it reminded me a little bit, if you felt the same, let me know, of Servant X Service or Servant Time Service that we discussed back in December. Yeah, I think I absolutely had a similar. Now you don't have the otaku element, but you have people in an office who are embroiled in various relationships, and it's a series of episodes about what happens with these people and their relationships. Yeah, the storytelling style is, like you said, the content is a little bit different, but the storytelling style and the story's setting bears pretty striking resemblance to that series. Yeah. Now we should mention to the listeners that if they don't already know, otaku are individuals who have an almost obsessive, if not obsessive, interest in something. Now, in this case, I think with the main characters, it's games and gaming. But it doesn't have to be games. It could be something like, as you mentioned, comics or anime. It can be, as we saw in Princess Jellyfish, which is all about otaku as well, trains, or any number of things. But if you have an obsession or almost an obsession with something where it defines your life and who you are and what you do and what you seek, then you're called an otaku. And what this does, you're right, in many ways, this kind of normalizes the otaku. Now, the main characters in this story, we have two couples. There's Narumi and Hirotaka, and they're the main couple. But there's a secondary couple who also work in the same office, Hanako and Taro. And basically, the stories in this first volume, and I'm assuming the second volume as well, and by the way, that comes out tomorrow as we record this on June 12th. It's about their various exploits. And I don't want to say that it's repetitive. The formula is repetitive. What do you do when you take these two
individuals or 4 individuals, all of whom are considered otaku, and, they're fine with that, and put them in a particular situation or a scenario. What happens? Mm-hmm. And so that's basically what all of the episodes in this book are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, you mentioned that it's, you got the sense that it's maybe for younger readers because it's kind of presented in this way that presupposes a certain way of consuming media. Right. And I think it's very similar to the kind of presuppositions of this sitcom format. I mean, the sitcom format does assume that you aren't really here for, complex, elaborate plots that are each distinct from one another, but that you are more interested in just kind of spending time with these characters, and that the kind of scenarios can be kind of repetitive, and that's kind of fine. In fact, that's often the point, is just kind of inure you to this experience in a lot of ways. And I see I think that's a good kind of analogy for how I was understanding the ways in which the kind of narrative was unfolding. That, it is repetitive, like you pointed out, but I got the sense that was sort of part of the genre, and that being part of the genre is kind of why I'm not too interested in these sorts of series, because for that very reason, because I'm not interested in what that format has to offer.
Right. And, I don't think that there's anything wrong with the format. It's just, it's not for me. Mm-hmm. Even in the design and layout of the various panels and pages, it's something that I think would appeal to a certain kind of reader. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is, at times there's too much text jammed into each of the panels. You'll have the text within the word balloon, obviously, but you'll also have little side text by the side of the head that you'll find in a lot of manga quite frequently, which is like their side thoughts, right? They're thinking this, or they want to say this in addition to what they just said in the word balloon. But also there's other text other than that many times in the panels. And I don't know, that kind of crowdedness kind of got to me in a bit. It's similar to watching a newscast and you see the ticker at the bottom and you see a second ticker at the bottom, and then you see some kind of animated little news clown up at the top right corner. There's just too much going on. Now, I think what I meant by younger is not younger in age, but those who are who grew up consuming media in an age where I was an adult. And so I just wasn't used to it, but I had to get used to it. But it was something that they grew up in. So of course, they're okay with it.
Yeah. It's the kind of format of, web comics or streaming.
Some web comics.
Well, yeah. But I mean, I think streaming is a good kind of example of the thing. It's this format that encourages people to just kind of consume more and more and more. And each little bit is just, it's basically just to get you to the next little bit, which itself is just to get you to the next little bit. And I agree. I mean, sometimes in some cases, I am guilty of doing that, but it's not the way I enjoy, consuming or experiencing, I should say, media.
Now, I said that this started as a webcomic on the Pixiv site. Have you ever been to the Pixiv site?
I've never been to the Pixiv site, although I am kind of familiar with, sort of familiar with it because it is also where my lesbian experience with loneliness was originally serialized. So I'm kind of aware of it and kind of I've heard the name before and kind of know what it is, but I've never actually been there.
Now, Shea and I haven't necessarily been, haven't had ringing endorsements of Wotakoi, but that doesn't mean that it's not a bad narrative. I do think, this has been popular for a reason. This strikes me as a more popular kind of manga. In other words, the kind of manga that you will see discussed among a lot of readers. In other words, okay, let's kind of imagine a reader of Wotakoi and a reader of Dead Demon. Okay. I don't want to define those individuals, but I just think that Wotakoi is going to sell more copies than Dead Demons, but maybe I'm wrong there because this is Asano we're talking about. But definitely it's different from the Troublemakers.
Yeah.
It's a different kind of reader with different kinds of expectations, with different kind of world experiences.
I would agree with that, though. I am hesitant to say that there's nothing wrong with that. The format of the series, which we kind of talked about, is analogous to the same format, the same relationship between kind of audience and art object that it establishes. That relationship is I don't want to say it's bad, because I think that might be going a little too far, and I want to be careful not to judge listeners who are a fan of this or a fan of this kind of format. I definitely understand the appeal of it, and it kind of it's designed to do the thing that it is doing. But I think we have to be careful to be maybe a little critical of the format, to think about how is this format making us feel? How is it affecting us? Is it, is experiencing media in this way? Is this good for us? I sort of think it's not. I sort of think, it's unhealthy to do too much of this sort of thing. And so I would like to add that we should be careful to be sort of critical of things like this, though that doesn't mean we can't we can't enjoy them if we enjoy them.
Okay, well, let me ask you this. Did you feel the same way a few years ago when we read and discussed Princess Jellyfish?
I didn't, though I will say that I think thinking back about Princess Jellyfish, its kind of depiction of otaku was a little different. I don't think it was quite as apologetic for otaku, although I could go and reread it and come away thinking completely different, and I just completely missed it in a first reading. But I think that's something to keep in mind. But then I also think that the storytelling of Princess Jellyfish isn't quite as repetitive as it is in Wotaku. Although that could just be an instance of I can't recall her first name, but it's Hagishimura, or is that her last name? The author of Princess Jellyfish. It could just be a case of she's doing the same thing as Fujita, the author of Wotakoi, but she's just better at hiding the fact that that's what she's doing. It could be a case of that, but I think I do feel differently about this and Princess Jellyfish, and I think it's to do with, on the one hand, there being a difference in how the authors are kind of the stories the authors are telling and the way they're telling those stories. Mm-hmm. But I also think that my relationship to art has changed, and just through the process of doing this podcast, the way you read and the things you look for and the way you understand certain things, it changes and develops, and so it could simply be the case of there's no difference between this series and Prince Jellyfish, but I am now in a position to to see what was really going on in this one. So yeah, I mean, I would be interested though in rereading that series because you're right, it is an interesting. It's a similar series, and so I would be interested to go back and look for those things specifically.
Well, I did recently go back and reread that first volume and then one or two other volumes of Princess Jellyfish. And my feeling is the perspective and tone and attitude toward otaku is the exact same as we see is Wotakoi. So the difference between the two, though, is in the format of storytelling. Right? Now, you could argue that Princess Jellyfish is kind of repetitive, a series of events, one right after the other. The difference, though, is that the stories, the events, the scenarios, the situations are stretched out. In other words, or explored much more fully. In other words, there seems to be something a little more novelistic about Princess Jellyfish, whereas Wotakoi comes across as a series of, well, one may think they're short stories, but I think they're just episodes like you would find on a sitcom, as you mentioned.
That's a good way. I was just about to say that it's more episodic. So I would agree that's how.
And I think that's one of the reasons why I felt that this may be repetitive in a way that I didn't feel that repetition in Princess Jellyfish.
Well, it's been a while since we've looked at it, and I hadn't reread it like you had, but I just might because now I am curious to see what I would make of some of that stuff.
Well, on this episode of the Comics Alternative Manga series, we discussed three very different books. We started off with Inio Asano's Dead Demons DDDD Destruction. After that, we looked at The Troublemakers, a collection by Baron Yoshimoto. And then we wrapped up with a text that we were kind of mixed about, and this is Fujita's Wotakoi, Love is Hard for Otaku. And congratulations, listener, you just went through the longest episode of the manga show that we've ever done.
Yes, I don't know if, give yourself a cookie.
Yes, give yourself. In fact, this is as long as almost 2 episodes of what we normally do. So this may be our promised, we're following up on our promise of giving you more in the future.
Two birds, one stone.
That's right. But they're interesting books and they're worth checking out. So consider doing that. And you can do so at the website of our sponsor, Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com and there you will find a whole slew of discounts every single month of manga and other kinds of comics. That's dcbservice.com. And after you do get your manga there, get in touch with us and let us know what you thought about this month's show. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you could leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up the phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
And as always, if you want to get in touch with two guys, you can get in touch with two guys at comicsalternative.com. If you want to get in touch with this guy in particular, you can email me at Shea@comicsalternative.com. And Derek, where can people go if they want to get in touch with you in particular?
At Derek@comicsalternative.com. And you can find us all over social media. We have accounts on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, YouTube, Pinterest, Slack, and Discord. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcasts. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on Spotify, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to the website, comicsalternative.com. I'm tired, Shay.
Yes, I'm sure our listeners are as well.
Yeah, but we hope you've enjoyed this show.
Yeah.
And we may or we may not be back later this month, but we'll definitely be back in July. Until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Shea.
Take care.